Alright, so fretting is always one of the funner things to do on building a guitar. It's definitely the most important because you can do any kind of body, but if your neck doesn't play right, then you've got pretty much a junk guitar. I've got most of the essential tools now that I've been doing this for a while. I've got a fret wire bender. I've got, a fret saw to clean out the frets. I've got a custom-made jig to do the end bevel and to do the side bevel, so that way it gets squared up properly. I've got a fret press jig here that I bought on eBay, and then I've got some jumbo fret wire, and I've got a fret set that I use to set the frets that won't sit. Essentially, you just start one by one, bend the fret wire, lay a little bit of glue, pound it in, press it down, and then keep moving through the fret wire down the fretboard. You do want to make sure that all the frets are clean, because if the frets aren't clean, the fret won't sit right. And if you get close to the end of the fret wire, just move on to the next piece of fret wire. Usually a full guitar takes about 3 fret wires, 3 strands of fret wire. The biggest thing is make sure you do it right with the frets versus having one sit up higher, one sit up lower. If you press them all down correctly and the fretboard is flat, you shouldn't have to do a whole lot of sanding down of the frets. So it's really important to make sure that the fretboard is clean, that the slots are clean, and this should go pretty smoothly. I've used a variety of different fret saws to clean out the fretboard slots. So this one will help clean out all the dust and get some of the glue out. And what I do is I go ahead and I use another fretboard slotting saw here, and I clean up the edges a little bit, so I've got a little bit on the edge. The worst part is when you get going, if you don't got enough nip on the end here, you won't get the fret seated properly. So I've cleaned up the fret slots. I'm going to go ahead and run some of the fret wire through the fret bending machine here. You can find these on eBay. Tons of guys make them. Pretty easy to make once you see how they're done. Essentially, this will just help clean, give me a good radius on the frets. I like over radiusing the frets versus under radiusing, because then as you pound these down, you get it to expand in the slot, and it sits a little better with all the tangs that are sticking out. And so, like I said, you always want to make sure you cut the ends of the fret wire off, because right here there's a little bit of a crimp from the first to from where it first starts bending to where it doesn't. So you always want to nip off the edges here as you're going through. That way you've got fully bent wire. Trick is not to do it all at once. Go back and forth, get the fret nice and radius once, a little bit easier. Doesn't stress out the machine as much. And from there you just start cutting. Alright, so now I've got the first fret wire done. Essentially I'll get it to shape, grab it, cut it with my flush trim side nippers here, pliers. Make sure I got a good fit, looks pretty good. Get my glue. I'll run a bead of glue inside here. Then I'll get the pressing jig set up. I've got a 12-degree radius pressing jig here. You can find these jigs for pretty cheap on eBay. You don't need to buy the StewMac one, but it is important that you buy the StewMac radius piece that you get in here. So essentially just push it in, push it down, glue, move to the next one. Alright, so now I've got the thin bead of glue in. Go ahead, get the frets set. Some guys do it one way, another do it another way. But I like to get it pressed in and then take the fret and just push it down. Alright, so now I've got the fret properly seated. What you want to see is the glue pushing out, and you want to see that you don't have any gaps. So essentially what I do now is I get a wet cloth and just wipe up the glue and go back and forth and keep doing that down the line here. The other trick that I have to stress here is that you want to do as much as you can before the neck is carved. and done. So get all the frets on, get it all set, because once you carve the neck or set the neck in, it's almost impossible to do anything else, because whatever you'll do, you'll ruin the body. So when you're doing all this cleanup on the sides, when you're doing the fret slot on the slots on the sides, it's much easier to work when the neck is still free and movable. Same thing as you set the neck and then begin to carve it. You really have a lot more freedom to do the fretting here, do the nut, do the drilling. It's much easier to move this than when you got the guitar bolted on and when you don't have it carved. So I always carve the neck after I do the frets. That way when I'm pressing these down, I've got a nice flat surface to push against in the fret press here. What I like to do now is get about, I don't know, 3/4 of the way done with the fretboard. Go ahead then, flip it over, clamp it down so that it glues pretty tightly. You know, if there is any frets that decide to raise up, they won't come up. I'll put one more clamp right here. That way I've got frets going down pretty good, and I'll finish the rest of the frets tonight. Alright, so now I've got the whole fretboard fretted at least, and I'm clamping down the last 3 frets that I did tonight. The biggest thing, like I said, is to take your time, make sure each fret is seated properly. And then the next step now is to go ahead and trim the edges here with my flatten end nippers. And so I bought a pair of pliers, sanded them down, same thing as the StewMac. Slowly nip each one of these as close, and then you get the file here, and we're going to go ahead and file down each side, essentially going back and forth, back and forth. That's pretty much the easiest part, and then you flip this over to get the 35-degree angle. So this is two-sided. One is the 35-degree angle, one is the flat side. Alright, so now I use my end clippers and I nip the ends here just so they're flush, and then I'll begin to sand these down with the end sander. I also have a small belt sander that I've used in the past, but the problem with using machinery on frets is that it heats up the frets. It may unseat the frets if you get the fret too hot. So I'll just go ahead and use the edge sander here with the file and be done with the edge. Alright, so I've clamped this down, and it's important that you have something to clamp down. Essentially, you just take the block on the flat side and sand. You keep going back and forth, and if you move it slightly up and down the fretboard, you can feel where you're taking off on each side. And so as soon as you start to see black on the file and you run your hand against it, you've got a pretty clean edge. So I could see black ebony. So then I just flip it over. Alright, the second step here with fretting now is to flip this over on the 35-degree side and go back and forth and put the edge on the frets, the 35-degree edge on the side. So I'll do that on both sides here, going back and forth. Flip this around, go this on this side. And the frets will be dressed from the side, the angle, and then what I'll do is I'll do the frets on the top. So now, I don't know if you can really tell from this camera angle, but every fret now has a bevel. It's flat, flush against the fretboard. What's great is as you learn to get the right depth, I pretty much got the fret seated properly in each section. So now all I'll do is go ahead and do the top of the fretboard. I'll mark each fret with a marker to see where the high spots are, and then I'll go back and forth with my StewMac aluminum fretboard radius. So that way when I do the marker, I know what fret is high, what fret is low, so that way as I'm going back and forth I can see the towel, dark spots and whatnot. So do I keep going or not? Alright, so now I've got the 12-degree radius fretboard with the 220. I start with 220 and then I move my way back up just so I don't get really aggressive. And the motion that I do when I do the fret sanding is I go back and forth like this, up and down the fretboard. That way I'm taking little bits, little bits, little bits, little bits. And as I get to the end, I'll do a couple big strokes to make sure that I'm all clear, but what I want to do is make sure that the frets are level back and forth. So you just don't sand, you go back and forth, up, back and forth, up, back and forth, up, back and forth. And then towards the end you do the full sand, just so you got everything nice and level. That way the fretboard doesn't play any tricks on you. Alright, so if you're just starting fretting, you could probably buy 1,000 different fretting tools. If you're starting out and you're only going to do a couple fret jobs, these are probably the best. An edge sander and the fret slotting or fret sanding tool from StuMac. These are both pretty cheap. Both will get the job done pretty well. Second is kind of the more old style, old school way of doing it. It's a StuMac tri-file, and essentially you can do the edges and you can do everything that you want. If you're going to do a lot of fret jobs, I think this is definitely the way to go. This is the StuMac 300 grit diamond fret tool. It's expensive. I think it was $100-something bucks, but this you can fly. I do enough fret work that this is a pretty handy tool. Other tool you need is the fret height gauge, so you can go back and forth as you're fretting and see where your high spots are, if there are any high spots left. It's got different sizes, so you can see where you rock back and forth across the frets. Surprisingly, this is a pretty good fret job that I've done already. Just have to clean up the frets with the tool, and essentially what you do is you just take it, go back and forth here until you've got the crown back on the fret, feel the edges where you've got some rough spots, and go back either with the edge tool or with the sandpaper and clean it up. So it doesn't matter which way you start from, as long as you've got a nice good work area to go from and that you can see. Now I'm going to take, now that I've done the whole fretboard, I've masked off a certain section. I'm going to take 400 grit and I'm going to rub it on the side to really essentially polish up the fret before I take the buffing wheel to it. This grit is about 240 and I want to get a higher grit. And so I rub this on the sides and on the top to get a lot of those finer scratch marks out. That's why when I go over with the buffing wheel, I'll get a much higher polish and I'll pull a lot of the scratches off. So if you just take this piece and begin to fold it, move it, you can take a pretty small piece a long way, and again you'll remove a lot of the fine scratches. So what I do is I just mask off the little sections as I go down. Some people mask the whole fretboard off before doing the fretting. I don't really think that's worthwhile. You can reuse the tape, save yourself some time if you just do fret by fret by fret. You know, I didn't really scratch the fretboard at all using the diamond fret file here. So as I get to the finer detail work, I'll begin to mask it off and move the tape and reuse what I've got. That way I'm not wasting anything. As you go through this, you'll begin to see that the frets that I've completed have a nice dull sheen on here now from using the 400, and these will still have some of the sand marks. You can't really tell, but essentially as I'm going through and doing this, you just go back and forth like this on each side to get all the scratch marks off. You continue down the fretboard to keep it clean. Alright, the next step here is I sand it down to 600 on the frets to get a little bit cleaner of a buff. From there then I take a steel wool and I go steel wool back and forth to get a little bit more of a shine and to get the fret nice and polished. The next thing I'll do is I'll use the StuMac buffing bits, and then I'll get a really nice sheen. I could probably even leave this as it is, but I like going an extra step to get nice polished frets. Do that here next. I'll show you myself.